I stood at the back of the church, hidden behind a marble column, watching as my husband of 8 years prepared to marry my former best friend. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd introduced them. My cream-colored envelope clenched tightly in. My trembling hand contained something that would change everything. As the officiant asked if anyone had reason these two shouldn't be joined in matrimony, I stepped forward. The gasps were audible as heads turned and recognized me. The look on Nathan's face, pure shock mixed with something else I couldn't quite name. Looking back at that moment now, I realize it was the first time in my life I truly stood up for myself. But to understand how I ended up crashing my husband's wedding to my best friend, and what happened next, we need to go back to where it all began. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The day I discovered Nathan was having an affair still plays in my mind with perfect clarity. It was an ordinary Tuesday in April, the kind where Seattle's perpetual drizzle made everything feel slightly melancholic. I'd left work early, canceling my last therapy session of the day to surprise Nathan with tickets to the jazz festival he'd been talking about for months. After 8 years of marriage, spontaneity had become rare between us, something I'd been trying to remedy. Our Craftsman home in Queen Anne was unusually quiet when I arrived. No music playing, no TV news in the background. Nathan's car was in the driveway, so I knew he was home. Probably working in his home office where he'd been spending more time lately, claiming his architectural firm was pushing deadlines on a major downtown project. I slipped off my rain boots and hung my coat carefully, excitement bubbling as I imagined his face when I showed him the tickets. We both loved jazz, and had met at a small club downtown where I'd gone alone after a particularly difficult day at my psychology practice. Nathan had offered to buy me a drink, and we'd spent the entire night talking about everything from Miles Davis to our shared love of rainy days. The sound of laughter stopped me halfway up the stairs. A woman's laugh, one I recognized instantly. Vivian, my closest friend since graduate school, the person who'd stood beside me at our wedding, who'd helped me pick out the pale blue paint for our bedroom walls, who came over every Sunday for brunch. The maid of honor who had cried during her toast about how Nathan and I were perfect for each other. Something in my chest tightened as I continued up the stairs, moving silently now, no longer eager to announce my presence. Our bedroom door was partially open, and through the crack, I could see clothing scattered across the hardwood floor. Nathan's button-down shirt, a burgundy dress I'd seen Vivian wear just last week when we'd met for coffee. Some part of me wanted to turn around, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, to protect myself from what I already knew was happening. But another part, a part I barely recognized, propelled me forward. I pushed the door open. The image is burned into my memory. Nathan and Vivian in our bed. The bed I'd saved for months to buy when we first moved in together. They didn't notice me at first, too wrapped up in each other. When Nathan finally saw me standing in the doorway, the look on his face wasn't even shame. It was annoyance at being interrupted. "Rebecca," he said, my name sounding foreign on his lips. "You're supposed to be at work." Not, "I'm sorry," or "this isn't what it looks like," or any of the cliched responses I might have expected, just irritation that I'd disrupted their afternoon. Vivian scrambled to cover herself with our sheet, the Egyptian cotton ones she'd helped me pick out during a weekend shopping trip. Her face was flushed, but there was something defiant in her expression too, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "How long?" My voice was surprisingly steady, even as I felt my world collapsing around me. Nathan sat up, running a hand through his dark hair, the same gesture I'd once found endearing. "Beck, let's talk about this rationally." Always the composed one, the one who approached everything with logic rather than emotion. It was what had drawn me to him initially, his steadiness, balancing my more empathetic nature. "How long?" I repeated, each word precise and cold. Vivian spoke then, her voice small but not apologetic. 7 months. 7 months. While she'd been helping me plan our anniversary dinner. While she'd listened to me worry about the growing distance between Nathan and me. While she'd suggested books on rekindling marriage and nodded sympathetically when I confessed my fears that he was losing interest. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. Instead, I walked to our closet, pulled out a suitcase, and placed it on the floor near the bed. "One of you needs to be gone by the time I get back," I said, surprised by my own composure. "I don't care which one." Nathan finally seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. He stood, wrapping a sheet around his waist. "Beck, wait. We need to talk about this." "We really should discuss this as adults," Vivian added, her therapist voice emerging, the same professional tone I used with clients. The audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. Adults. I laughed, and it sounded hollow even to my own ears. Adults don't sleep with their best friend's husband behind their back for 7 months. Adults don't betray the people who trust them most. I turned and walked out, ignoring Nathan calling my name. I made it all the way to my car before the tears came, blurring my vision as I gripped the steering wheel, unsure where to go. My office was empty this late in the afternoon. My parents lived 3 states away, and every friend I might have called in a crisis was connected to Vivian in some way. We'd shared the same social circle for years. I ended up at Powell's Coffee House, a tiny place near the waterfront where Nathan and I had never gone together. The barista gave me a concerned look as I ordered a large black coffee with shaking hands, but mercifully asked no questions. I found a corner table and sat staring out at Elliott Bay, watching ferries traverse the gray waters as my coffee grew cold. My phone buzzed incessantly, Nathan calling, then texting, then Vivian doing the same. I turned it off completely. Their messages could wait. Right now, I needed to breathe, to make sense of how my life had imploded so completely in the span of an afternoon. The logical part of my brain, the professional therapist who helped others through crisis, tried to engage. Had there been signs I'd missed? The late nights at work, the sudden interest in improving his wardrobe, the way he'd become protective of his phone. All classic signs of infidelity I'd recognized in my clients' stories, but had somehow been blind to in my own marriage. And Vivian, her sudden interest in my marriage problems, always asking about Nathan, suggesting I give him space when he seemed distant. Had she been manufacturing problems between us? Or had they emerged naturally, creating an opening she'd exploited? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. Hours passed as I sat immobile, watching the sky darken over the water. When the coffee house closed at 9, I finally turned my phone back on to find 27 missed calls and a dozen text messages. I ignored them all and booked a room at a downtown hotel, unable to face returning home, unsure if Nathan or Vivian would still be there. The hotel room was sterile and anonymous, the kind of place that existed outside of real life. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my work clothes, feeling disconnected from my body, from the life I'd been living just hours before. The woman who'd left her office early with concert tickets seemed like a stranger now. Naive, trusting, oblivious. When I finally slept, my dreams were vivid and disjointed. Vivian in my wedding dress, Nathan building a house with glass walls, where everyone could see inside, me trying to speak but no sound coming out. I woke at dawn, disoriented and hollow, the reality of my situation crashing back as consciousness returned. I showered mechanically, put on the same clothes from yesterday, and checked out. It was time to go home and face whatever remained of my life. Whatever choice Nathan had made, to stay or to go, I would have to begin the process of understanding what came next. The drive back to Queen Anne was surreal. Morning commuters all around me living their normal Wednesday lives while mine had been fundamentally altered. I rehearsed what I might say if Nathan was still there, prepared myself for the possibility of finding Vivian instead, or perhaps both of them, ready to explain why their betrayal was somehow justified or inevitable. What I didn't expect was the emptiness that greeted me. The house was silent. No Nathan, no Vivian. But signs of hasty departure were everywhere. Dresser drawers partially open, gaps on bookshelves where Nathan's architecture books had been, the framed photo of our wedding day lying face down on his nightstand. On the kitchen counter was a handwritten note. "I'm staying at Vivian's. We need to talk when you're ready. I'm sorry it happened this way." Not sorry it happened, just sorry it happened this way. Sorry I'd caught them. Sorry their comfortable arrangement had been disrupted. I sank into a kitchen chair. The note crumpled in my fist and finally allowed myself to really cry, deep, wrenching sobs that left me gasping for air. For everything I'd lost, for the future I'd planned, for the trust that had been shattered so completely I couldn't imagine ever feeling whole again. What I didn't know then, as I sat alone in my half-empty kitchen, was that this devastating moment would eventually lead me to discover a strength I never knew I possessed, and to a series of events that would culminate in that dramatic moment at the back of a church, holding an envelope that would change everything. The days following my discovery blurred together in a fog of grief and disbelief. I called in sick to my practice, something I'd never done before, even when battling the flu last winter. My assistant, Elena, managed my schedule, rescheduling clients without asking questions. The thought of sitting across from people discussing their problems, helping them navigate their emotions when mine were in complete disarray, seemed impossible. I existed in a state of suspended animation, moving through the house like a ghost, touching objects that suddenly felt alien. The copper kettle Nathan had brought back from a trip to London, the throw pillows Vivian had helped me choose, wedding photos I couldn't bear to look at but lacked the energy to put away. Every corner of our home contained some remnant of betrayal, some memory now tainted. My phone continued to buzz with messages. Nathan, alternating between apologies and explanations. "It just happened. We didn't mean to hurt you. We need to talk about next steps." Each message is more infuriating than the last, as if an 8-year marriage dissolving was something that just happened, like rain on a picnic or a flat tire. Vivian's messages were worse, clinical, almost therapeutic. "I understand you're hurting. When you're ready to talk, I'm here. We both care about you and want to resolve this in a healthy way." The sheer audacity of her position, betraying me, then offering to help me process that betrayal, left me breathless with rage. I deleted every message without responding. On the third day, I finally answered a call, not from Nathan or Vivian, but from Dr. Harriet Collins, my former advisor from graduate school and the closest thing I had to a mentor. Elena must have contacted her, worried about my sudden disappearance from work. "Rebecca," her familiar voice was steady, comforting. "I'm at Powell's. Join me for coffee in 30 minutes. It wasn't a request, but a gentle command, and I found myself grateful for the direction. I'd barely left the house, surviving on crackers and whatever I could find in the pantry, still wearing the same sweatpants and UW hoodie I'd put on days ago. I showered quickly, the hot water bringing me back to myself somewhat. In the mirror, I barely recognized the pale, hollow-eyed woman staring back at me. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my usually carefully maintained chestnut hair hung limp around my face. I made a minimal effort. Clean jeans, a sweater, a swipe of tinted moisturizer that did little to hide the evidence of sleepless nights. Powell's was quiet when I arrived, just a few remote workers tapping on laptops. Harriet sat in the back corner, 2 steaming mugs already on the table. At 64, she remained formidable, silver hair cut in a precise bob, posture perfect, eyes sharp behind stylish glasses. She'd been divorced twice herself, had built a renowned private practice, written 3 books, and never suffered fools gladly. If anyone could help me navigate this wasteland, it was her. "You look terrible," she said without preamble as I sat down. A laugh escaped me, rusty from disuse. "Hello to you too." Elena called me, said you'd canceled all appointments indefinitely. "Not like you." "My husband is sleeping with my best friend. I'm not feeling very professional right now." The words came out bitter and raw, the first time I'd said them aloud. Harriet nodded, unsurprised. "Elena mentioned something along those lines. Nathan and Vivian? 7 months. Even saying it felt like pressing on a bruise. In our bed." She pushed a mug toward me. "Drink your coffee. Have you eaten today?" I shook my head, taking a sip. The rich, bitter taste was grounding. Food after this. Now tell me everything. So I did. The tickets, the laughter on the stairs, the confrontation, the note. Harriet listened without interruption, her expression neutral but eyes alert, absorbing every detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What are you most afraid of right now?" she finally asked. The question caught me off guard. I'd been expecting sympathy, outrage on my behalf, not this pointed inquiry. "I don't know." "Everything? Being alone. Never trusting anyone again. Having to see them together. Having to tell people what happened." My voice broke. Knowing that even my professional training didn't help me see what was happening in my own marriage. "That's normal," Harriet said firmly, "but temporary. What you're experiencing is a trauma response. Your foundation has been shattered. Your brain is trying to process a fundamental betrayal from the 2 people you trusted most. It will take time." "How much time?" I sounded desperate, even to myself. "That depends on you." She leaned forward. "Rebecca, you have 2 choices now. You can let this define you. Become bitter, mistrustful, shut down. Or you can use it as a catalyst to rebuild yourself into something stronger. Different, yes, but stronger. How am I supposed to do that when I can barely get dressed in the morning?" "One day at a time, starting with professional boundaries." Her tone shifted, becoming more clinical. "You need to contact Nathan through a lawyer, not directly. Every interaction should be documented. And for God's sake, stop reading Vivian's messages. Block them both." "A lawyer?" The word made it real in a new way. That seems so final. "It is final, Rebecca." Her directness was jarring but necessary. "The moment you found them together, your marriage ended. The only question now is how you'll handle the aftermath." We talked for over an hour. Harriet helped me outline immediate next steps. Finding a lawyer, taking a proper leave from my practice rather than calling in sick indefinitely, considering whether to stay in the house or find a new place. Practical matters that gave me something to focus on beyond the constant replay of betrayal. Before we parted, she gripped my hand tightly. "Listen to me. You're going to survive this. Not just survive, eventually thrive. But first, you need to protect yourself, legally and emotionally." "Can you do that?" I nodded, feeling the first stirrings of resolve beneath the grief. "Good. Call me tomorrow after you've spoken to Elena about your schedule. And Rebecca..." Her eyes were kind, but firm. "Don't make any major decisions for at least 6 months. No selling the house, no quitting your practice, no dramatic haircuts. Give yourself time to find solid ground again." That night, I followed her first piece of advice. I blocked both Nathan and Vivian's numbers. The immediate relief was palpable, like turning down the volume on a blaring television. Then I did something equally important. I called my parents. "In Arizona," my mother answered, her voice immediately concerned when she heard mine. I'd been avoiding them, not wanting to admit the failure of my marriage, especially to my mother who had always adored Nathan. But as I told them what had happened, her allegiance shifted instantly. "That absolute bastard," she said, making me blink in surprise. My mother rarely swore. And Vivian? After everything you've done for her? Rebecca, pack a bag. Come stay with us for a few weeks. Get away from Seattle completely. For a moment, the offer was tempting. To retreat to my childhood, home, let my parents buffer me from reality. But Harriet's words echoed in my mind. This was something I needed to face, not flee. I can't leave right now, Mom. I have the practice, clients who depend on me, legal things to sort out. Then we'll come to you, she said immediately. No, not yet. I need to figure out some things first, on my own. There was a pause. Then my father's voice came on the line. Becky, whatever you need, we're here. Money? Legal advice? Someone to break Nathan's kneecaps? A choked laugh escaped me. My gentle 68-year-old professor father offering. Violence was both absurd and deeply touching. Thanks, Dad. I'll keep the kneecap option in reserve. After we hung up, I sat on the couch, surrounded by the remnants of my married life, and felt something shift inside me. The conversation with Harriet, my parents' instant support, they were reminders that while my marriage and friendship had been false, not everything in my life was. There were still people I could trust, still parts of my foundation that remained solid. The next morning, I called Elena and explained I needed an extended leave, at least 2 weeks, possibly more. She was efficient and understanding, already having rescheduled my most urgent clients with colleagues who could step in. Next, I contacted Sarah Jenkins, a divorce attorney Harriet had recommended, and made an appointment for the following day. These small actions, reaching out, making plans, setting boundaries, were exhausting but necessary. Each one required pushing past the inertia of grief, forcing myself to function when all I wanted was to curl around my pain and disappear. That afternoon, I finally ventured into our home office, Nathan's architectural drawings still pinned to the walls, my therapy, journals neatly lined on shelves. It felt like entering a museum of our former lives. I booted up my laptop and, steeling myself, logged into our joint bank accounts. What I found sent ice through my veins. Nathan had already transferred half of our savings, nearly $75,000, to a separate account. He'd done it the very day I'd discovered them, hours after I'd walked out. While I'd been sitting shell-shocked at Powell's, he'd been methodically separating our finances. The betrayal felt fresh again, sharp-edged and cruel. Not content with destroying our marriage, he was now ensuring he got his share before I could protest. The calculated nature of it made me wonder how long he'd been planning this. If the affair with Vivian was merely the visible part of a much larger deception. I printed the transaction records with shaking hands, adding them to the folder I was preparing for Sarah Jenkins. Then, following an impulse I didn't fully understand, I went to the file cabinet where we kept important documents. Our marriage certificate, property deed, insurance policies, and a folder labeled Thornfield Project. The Thornfield Project was Nathan's dream, a luxury condominium development on waterfront property north of the city. He'd been talking about it for years, had preliminary designs drawn up, but couldn't secure the backing or permits needed to move forward. It had been a source of frustration for him, a professional milestone constantly out of reach. I hesitated, then took the folder. I didn't know if it would be important legally, but something told me to keep it close. This instinct, to protect myself, to gather information, to prepare for whatever came next, was new and unfamiliar, but it felt right. Necessary. That night, I slept without dreaming for the first time since finding them together. Not peacefully, but deeply, the exhaustion of grief finally claiming me. When I woke the next morning, the pain was still there, a constant companion I suspected would remain for some time. But alongside it was something else. A tiny seed of determination, barely visible beneath the devastation, but undeniably present. I didn't know it then, but that seed would eventually grow into the strength that would not only help me survive this betrayal, but ultimately lead me to that moment at the back of the church, watching as Nathan prepared to marry Vivian, holding an envelope that would change everything. "You need to get out of that house," Sarah Jenkins declared, closing the folder containing the financial documents I'd brought to our meeting. Barely 5 feet tall with a New York accent that 30 years in Seattle hadn't diminished, she commanded the space of her corner office with the authority of someone twice her size. "It's a psychological minefield. We'd spent the past hour going through the details of my situation, the length of my marriage, the discovery of the affair, Nathan's immediate transfer of funds." Sarah had listened intently, occasionally making notes but mostly observing me with sharp, assessing eyes. "I know," I admitted, "but it's half mine. Why should I be the one to leave?" "Because healing matters more than proving a point." She leaned forward, tapping a manicured nail on her desk. "Rebecca, I've handled hundreds of divorces. The clients who recover fastest are those who create clean breaks. New space, new patterns, new beginnings." I stared out her office window at the Seattle skyline, considering her words. The thought of leaving our Queen Anne home felt like another loss, but staying was its own kind of torture. Every room haunted by memories both beautiful and now poisoned. "The house can be dealt with in the settlement," Sarah continued. "But your immediate well-being is the priority. Do you have somewhere you could go? Family? A friend?" My parents offered, "but they're in Tucson. And friends?" I trailed off. Most of our social circle had been built around both Nathan and Vivian. I had colleagues, acquaintances, but few connections that felt solid enough to lean on in crisis. "It's complicated." Sarah studied me, then checked her watch. "I have one more appointment today, but I want you to meet someone before you leave." She picked up her phone and sent a quick text. "Marcus, can you come to my office for a moment?" Minutes later, a knock at the door preceded the entrance of a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped salt and pepper hair. His dark skin contrasted with a crisp white dress shirt, and behind wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes were kind but evaluating. "Rebecca Parker, this is Marcus Washington. He handles real estate for many of my clients, specializes in finding temporary housing for people in transition." Sarah's description was professional, but the warmth in her voice suggested Marcus was more than just a business associate. "Transition," Marcus repeated with a subtle smile. "That's what we call it now? Used to be escaping a lying, cheating spouse, but I guess transition sounds more elegant." He extended his hand to me. "Nice to meet you, Rebecca. Sorry about the circumstances." His directness was unexpected but somehow comforting. No platitudes, no awkward sympathy, just acknowledgement of the situation's painful reality. "Marcus has a knack for finding exactly the right space for people starting over," Sarah explained. "He's helped dozens of my clients. I'm also a pretty decent listener," Marcus added, "which comes in handy when you're helping someone figure out what they actually need versus what they think they need." Something about his manner, straightforward but gentle, reminded me of my father. I felt myself relax slightly for the first time since entering the imposing law office. "I'm not sure I'm ready to move," I said. "The house is just a house," Marcus finished. "A beautiful one in Queen Anne, from what Sarah mentioned, but still just wood and concrete. Your peace of mind is worth more." We arranged to meet the YIG following day for coffee to discuss options. No commitment required. As I left Sarah's office with a folder full of paperwork to complete and first steps for the divorce process, I felt oddly lighter. Not happy. Happiness seemed a distant, almost forgotten state, but perhaps slightly more anchored. The next morning, I arrived at Cafe Flora 15 minutes early, another habit from my married life. Nathan had always been chronically late, so I'd compensated by arriving everywhere with time to spare. Now I sat with an herbal tea, watching rain streak the windows and wondering how many of my behaviors had been shaped by accommodating his needs and failings. Marcus arrived precisely on time, shaking rain from his umbrella before spotting me. He ordered coffee, black, and settled across from me with a leather portfolio. "So," he began without preamble, "tell me what you love about your house and what you hate about it now." The question was so direct, so perfectly attuned to my situation, that I found myself answering without hesitation. I love the craftsman details, the built-in bookshelves, the window seat in the living room. I hate that they had sex in our bedroom. I hate the kitchen island where we used to make Sunday breakfast together. I hate the front porch where he kisses me goodbye every morning. Marcus nodded, making brief notes. "And if you could live anywhere else in Seattle, money and practicality aside, where would it be?" "Somewhere with water," I said immediately, surprising myself with certainty. I've always loved the sound of water. Nathan preferred the hills for the architecture, but I've always been drawn to the lakes or the sound. Interesting. He made another note. "What about size? The Queen Anne house is what, 3 bedrooms?" "4, I corrected. "Way too big for one person. It always felt a little too big, honestly, but Nathan wanted—" I stopped, realizing how many decisions had been driven by Nathan's preferences. Something smaller would be fine. A condo maybe, or a small house. Just enough space for me and my books. Marcus continued asking questions about my commute to my practice, my daily routines, what I needed versus what I'd accumulated over 8 years of marriage. It wasn't just about real estate. He was helping me disentangle my authentic needs from the compromises I'd made for so long they'd become invisible. "I have a few places in mind," he said finally, closing his portfolio. "But before I show you any properties, I want you to do something." "What's that?" "Pack a bag, 1 suitcase with essentials, clothes, toiletries, whatever you absolutely need, for the next week, then come stay at my guest house for a few days." I blinked, caught completely off guard. "Your guest house? But we just met." I couldn't impose. He raised a hand, smiling slightly. "It's not an imposition. It's part of the service." Sarah didn't explain. "I maintain a small guest house specifically for clients in your situation. It's private, secure, and separate from my main house. Gives you breathing room to clear your head before making any decisions." The offer was unexpected but tempting. A neutral space, away from the memories saturating my home, sounded like exactly what I needed. "It's not charity," Marcus added, seeming to read my hesitation. "You can pay a nominal rent if it makes you more comfortable. Consider it a practical step. You need space to think. I have space available." Something about his matter-of-fact approach made the offer easier to accept. No pity, no emotional complications, just a straightforward solution to an immediate problem. "Okay," I said finally. "Thank you. That would be helpful." We arranged for me to arrive that evening. As I drove home to pack, I realized this would be my first night away from the house by choice rather than a shock-induced flight. It felt significant somehow, a small reclamation of agency. Packing proved more emotional than I'd anticipated. Each item I selected represented a choice about what parts of my previous life to bring forward and what to leave behind. The cashmere sweater Nathan had given me for Christmas, left hanging in the closet. The well-worn UW sweatshirt from my graduate school days, folded carefully into my suitcase. My grandmother's silver hairbrush, packed. The framed photo of Nathan and me in Maui, placed face down in a drawer. I was nearly finished when the doorbell rang. My heart jumped painfully. Nathan returning for more belongings? Vivian coming to talk? But when I peered through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't immediately recognize. Opening the door cautiously, I found myself face to face with Diana Chen, my neighbor from 3 houses down. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, but never moved beyond surface-level acquaintance. "Rebecca," she said, her expression determined. "I've been trying to catch you for days. May I come in?" Bewildered, I stepped aside to let her enter. Diana was a corporate attorney, always impeccably dressed and usually rushing between her BMW and front door with barely time for a wave. Today, she seemed deliberately unhurried, studying me with concern. "I'll be direct," she said once we'd settled in the living room. "I overheard your husband and Vivian talking in your backyard last week. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but their voices. Carried and what I heard?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Let's just say it confirmed what the neighborhood has suspected for months." "Months?" I repeated, a new wave of humiliation washing over me. "Everyone knew?" "Not knew," Diana clarified quickly. "Suspected. Nathan's car often here when you were at work, Vivian coming and going with her own key. People noticed, but no one wanted to be the one to tell you without certainty." I closed my eyes briefly, absorbing this fresh pain. Not only had I been betrayed, but I'd been the subject of neighborhood speculation and pity. The last to know what was happening in my own home. "I'm not here to gossip," Diana continued, her tone softening. "I'm here because I heard them discussing finances. Specifically, the Thornfield project." My eyes snapped open. "What about it?" "Nathan mentioned permits being approved next month. Said once they were married, Vivian's family connections with the zoning board would finally make it happen. He seemed to believe it would be worth millions once developed. The Thornfield project, Nathan's perpetually stalled development dream. The folder I'd impulsively taken from our files suddenly felt significant in new ways. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, studying her face for motive. Diana met my gaze, directly. "Because 8 years ago, your husband represented me in my divorce. I was blindsided, just like you. No one spoke up for me. No one shared information that might have helped. I won't be that bystander again." I'd forgotten that Nathan had handled legal work before transitioning fully to architectural development. The connection made Diana's visit both more understandable and more valuable. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "This is important information." After Diana left, I sat motionless on the couch, pieces rearranging themselves in my mind. If the Thornfield project was finally moving forward after years of delays, if permits were imminent, and if Vivian's family connections were the key, this wasn't just an affair. This was strategic. Nathan needed Vivian, or rather, needed her family's influence, to unlock the project that could establish him as a major developer. I thought of the money he'd immediately transferred, the calculated nature of his departure. How much of our marriage had been genuine, and how much a convenient arrangement until something more advantageous came along. With renewed purpose, I retrieved the Thornfield folder from where I'd hidden it and added it to my suitcase. Then I did something I'd been avoiding. I walked through our bedroom, past the bed I could no longer look at, to the closet where Nathan had left behind less essential items. From the top shelf, I took a small lockbox where he kept backup drives and personal documents. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but Diana's information had awakened something in me. A determination to understand the full scope of what had happened, not just the betrayal I'd witnessed, but the calculation behind it. As I drove to Marcus's address that evening, rain pounding on the windshield, I felt a curious mix of emotions. Grief and anger still predominated, but underneath was something new, a spark of resolve, small but growing stronger. For the first time since finding Nathan and Vivian together, I wasn't just reacting to events. I was beginning to think beyond the immediate pain toward whatever might come next. Marcus's house was a beautifully restored craftsman in Madison Park, set back from the street behind mature maple trees. The guest house, as promised, was separate from the main residence, a small but elegant structure behind the garden with its own entrance from the side street. "It's not much," he said, showing me inside, "but it's private and peaceful." It was considerably more than not much. A thoughtfully designed studio with a small kitchen, sitting area, and sleeping alcove. Large windows overlooked a Japanese-inspired garden where a stone fountain created gentle, constant sound. The furnishings were simple but beautiful. A love seat in soft blue, a reading chair beside a standing lamp, bookshelves filled with an eclectic collection. "It's perfect," I said honestly, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly. No memories here, no ghosts, just clean space and the soothing sound of water. "Make yourself at home," Marcus said, handing me a key. "I'll respect your privacy, but I'm just across the garden if you need anything." "And Rebecca—" He paused at the door, his expression kind but serious. "This is the first step of many. It gets easier." After he left, I unpacked my single suitcase, placing my grandmother's hairbrush on the small vanity, arranging the few books I'd brought on the nightstand. Then I sat in the reading chair, listening to the fountain's gentle music and feeling, for the first time in days, like I might actually be able to breathe again. 3 days in Marcus's guest house had given me something I desperately needed: perspective. Away from the house filled with memories and betrayal, I could finally think clearly. Each morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through bamboo blinds and the gentle sound of the fountain outside. Each night, I slept without nightmares for the first time since discovering Nathan and Vivian together. On my 4th morning, I sat cross-legged on the small patio outside the guest house, a journal open on my lap. Marcus had suggested I try writing, not just about the betrayal, but about everything. "Sometimes," he'd said, "we don't know what we're thinking until we see it on paper." So I wrote, hesitantly at first, then with increasing fluidity. About the affair, yes, but also about my marriage, before the betrayal. About patterns I'd ignored, compromises that had slowly eroded my sense of self, warning signs I'd rationalized away. Nathan and I had met at a critical juncture in my life. I was just finishing my doctoral program, exhausted from years of academic pressure, uncertain about my next steps. He had seemed so solid, so confident in his path. His certainty had been intoxicating. Here was someone who knew exactly what he wanted and how to get it. I realized now how quickly I'd adopted his dreams as our shared vision. His desire for the Queen Anne house, his career ambitions, his social connections, they had all become the framework around which I built my life. My own aspirations, building a practice focused on trauma recovery, maybe teaching part-time at the university, writing articles for professional journals, had gradually taken secondary positions, then faded to background noise. The day before, I'd finally returned to my practice, seeing a limited schedule of clients. The familiar work had been grounding, a reminder that I did have value and purpose beyond my failed marriage. Elena had managed everything beautifully in my absence, showing me again how much I'd underestimated the support available to me outside my relationship with Nathan. A light knock on the garden gate interrupted my thoughts. Marcus stood there, 2 coffee mugs in hand. "Morning reflection?" he asked, nodding toward my journal. "Morning excavation," I amended, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Digging through the rubble to see what's salvageable." He smiled slightly. "Find anything worth keeping?" I considered the question seriously. My professional judgment, surprisingly intact despite personal blindness. My capacity for hard work, my parents' unconditional support. I paused, sipping the coffee. But I'm also finding things I'd forgotten were buried there. Ambitions I set aside, boundaries I shouldn't have allowed to be crossed. Marcus nodded, settling into the other patio chair. "That's the unexpected gift of betrayal. It forces reevaluation, not just of the relationship that failed, but of everything." "That sounds like the voice of experience," I observed. His expression turned distant. 15 years ago, my wife left me for my business partner. They embezzled nearly $500,000 from our construction company before disappearing together to Brazil. He shrugged, the gesture conveying acceptance rather than indifference. It nearly destroyed me. Financially, emotionally, completely. But rebuilding from zero means you get to decide exactly what the foundation looks like. The revelation stunned me. Marcus had been so steady, so composed. I'd never imagined he'd experienced something potentially more devastating than my own situation. Is that why you help Sarah's clients? Because of what happened to you? Partly, he acknowledged. But also, because isolation is the most dangerous part of betrayal. People withdraw when they're hurt, exactly when they most need community. I thought about my own instinct to hide, to lick my wounds in private, rather than face pitying glances or awkward conversations. It's hard to let people see you at your most vulnerable. Hardest thing in the world, he agreed. But necessary. Which reminds me. He pulled an envelope from his pocket. I found 3 properties that might interest you when you're ready. No rush, but something to consider. I took the envelope, grateful for both the information and his understanding that I wasn't ready to make decisions yet. Thank you. For everything. That's what the community does, he said simply, standing to leave. One more thing. Sarah asked me to remind you about your appointment with her tomorrow afternoon. Something about new documents that need reviewing. After Marcus left, I opened the envelope, studying the property listings he'd selected. All 3 were near water. A small house on Lake Washington, a modern apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, and a houseboat on Portage Bay. Each represented a complete departure from the Queen Anne house, from the life I'd built with Nathan. The thought of such radical change was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I tried to imagine myself in each space, separate from Nathan's taste and influence, creating an environment that reflected only my own preferences and needs. It was harder than it should have been. After 8 years, the boundaries between his choices and mine had blurred considerably. Later that afternoon, feeling stronger than I had in days, I decided to check the backup drive I'd taken from Nathan's lockbox. It was a simple USB, unlabeled and unremarkable. I plugged it into my laptop, not sure what I expected to find. The contents were initially disappointing, mostly architectural drawings, spreadsheets, and documents I already knew about. But in a folder labeled Thornfield Correspondence, I found a series of emails between Nathan and various members of the King County Zoning Board spanning the past year. Scanning them quickly, I saw repeated references to zoning changes, permit exceptions, and navigating regulatory challenges. Nothing obviously illegal, but the tone suggested Nathan had been working multiple angles to move his project forward, often expressing frustration at bureaucratic roadblocks. A more recent email thread mentioned a board member named Lawrence Chen, Diana's husband, I realized with a start, and Nathan's concern that Lawrence remained the primary obstacle. Then I found it, an email from 3 months ago from Vivian to Nathan, sent to his personal account rather than his work email. Nathan, finally talked to Uncle James about your situation with the Thornfield permits. He said Lawrence Chen is a problem because he's concerned about environmental impact reports, but James thinks he can be circumvented if necessary. The family has considerable influence with other board members. We should discuss this in person rather than email. Dinner. Tonight, Vi and Nathan's reply. Dinner is perfect. This could change everything for the project. You're amazing. I'll make reservations at Canlis, 8 p.m. I sat back, a cold clarity washing over me. 3 months ago, while I'd been working late at my practice, Nathan and Vivian had been dining at one of Seattle's most expensive restaurants, plotting how to use her family connections to advance his project, the same project that had been his obsession for years, the achievement he believed would cement his reputation in Seattle's development community. This wasn't just an affair born of attraction or midlife crisis. This was calculated, strategic, a business arrangement disguised as romance. How long has it been developing? Had their physical relationship begun before or after Vivian offered her family's influence? Did it even matter? I copied the emails to my own drive, then checked the calendar on the backup. Nathan tracked everything meticulously: appointments, meetings, deadlines. Scrolling back through the months, I noticed a pattern. Regular meetings labeled simply V, beginning almost a year ago, usually at times when I had standing client appointments. The 7-month timeline Vivian had given when confronted was a lie. Whatever was between them had been developing much longer. Then a specific entry caught my eye, dated just 2 weeks ago. Ring Alexandrite. Nathan knew I loved Alexandrite, had always admired its color-changing properties. Was he planning to give Vivian a ring with my favorite stone? The petty cruelty of it made my stomach turn, but there was something else about the date that nagged at me. I checked my own calendar, confirming what I'd suspected. That same day, I'd had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Matsui, the fertility specialist we'd been consulting for the past year. An appointment Nathan had been too busy to attend, leaving me to hear alone that our latest round of treatments had failed. While I'd been processing that heartbreak, he'd been shopping for an engagement ring for my best friend. Something inside me hardened then, not into bitterness, but into resolve. This wasn't just emotional betrayal. It was calculated deception on multiple fronts. Nathan hadn't just discarded our marriage. He'd been actively constructing its replacement while I was still fully invested, still believing in our future together, still trying to create a family with him. I gathered the emails, the calendar entries, and the information Diana had shared, organizing them into a coherent timeline. The picture that emerged was damning. Nathan had cultivated a relationship with Vivian specifically because her family connections could help unblock the Thornfield project, the development that he believed would transform him from a moderately successful architect into a major Seattle developer. Tomorrow's meeting with Sarah Jenkins took on new significance. This wasn't just about dividing assets from a failed marriage. It was about ensuring I wasn't further victimized by Nathan's manipulations. The emotional pain remained, but it was now accompanied by a clear-eyed assessment of what I was dealing with. Not just a cheating husband, but a man who had strategically used both my best friend and me to advance his ambitions. That evening, I sat in the reading chair by the window, watching twilight settle over Marcus's garden. The fountain's gentle music provided a counterpoint to my thoughts, which for the first time since discovering the affair, felt ordered and purposeful rather than chaotic. I picked up my phone and did something I'd been avoiding. I looked at my social media accounts. As expected, there were concerned messages from friends wondering why I'd gone silent, oblivious to the implosion of my marriage. But more revealing were the photos posted by mutual acquaintances. A dinner party 3 weeks ago where Nathan and Vivian sat together, his hand casually on her shoulder. A charity auction where they stood too close for casual friendship. A hiking group where they appeared in the background, clearly a couple. They hadn't even been particularly discreet. The realization was like ice water. So many people must have seen, must have known or suspected, yet no one had said anything to me. The social circle I'd believed was ours, built over 8 years of dinner parties, weekend trips, fundraisers, and professional events, had silently absorbed Nathan and Vivian's relationship while I remained oblivious. Or had they? I thought. Of Diana's visit, her decision to share what she'd overheard. Perhaps others had wanted to speak but hadn't known how, hadn't been certain enough to risk upending my life with suspicions. I closed the social media apps and instead opened my contacts. For too long, I'd isolated myself in my pain, reaching out only to those already aware of the situation. Harriet, my parents, Sarah. But I had other connections, other friendships that existed independently of Nathan and Vivian. I scrolled to Meera Patel's number. We'd been close during graduate school before her research took her to San Francisco 5 years ago. We still exchanged birthday messages and occasional updates, But I'd let the friendship fade, too busy with the life Nathan and I were building to nurture connections that didn't directly serve our shared social goals. Before I could overthink it, I pressed call. Rebecca? Mira's voice was warm with surprise. Is everything okay? It's been ages. No, I said honestly. Everything is not okay, but I think maybe it could be, eventually. Do you have time to talk? As I explained what had happened, the discovery, the aftermath, the revelations about Nathan's calculations, Mira listened without interruption. When I finished, her response wasn't pity, but quiet fury on my behalf, followed by practical support. Offers to visit, to connect me with friends in Seattle I might not know, to help however she could. By the time we hung up an hour later, I felt something I hadn't experienced since finding Nathan and Vivian together. Connection. Not just to Mira specifically, but to the wider world, to possibilities beyond the narrow frame of my marriage. I slept deeply that night, and in the morning, I woke with unprecedented clarity. Looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized, not just because of the shadows under my eyes or the weight I'd lost in the past weeks, but because the woman staring back at me seemed different in fundamental ways. Stripped of illusions, yes, but also stripped of constraints I'd accepted for too long. As I prepared for my appointment with Sarah Jenkins, selecting a charcoal pencil skirt and burgundy blouse I'd always loved but Nathan had thought too academic, I realized I was approaching a crossroads. I could remain defined by betrayal, perpetually Nathan's ex-wife, the woman who had been replaced. Or I could begin seeing myself as someone in progress, someone being revealed rather than diminished by this painful transition. I chose the second option, not because it was easier, it wasn't, but because in the rubble of my marriage, I'd uncovered something unexpected. A foundation of personal strength I'd forgotten existed, waiting to support whatever I decided to build next. He wants to buy you out of the house, Sarah Jenkins announced, reading from the document Nathan's lawyer had sent over, offering fair market value for your half of the equity, minus what he calls reasonable considerations for improvements primarily funded by his income. Her tone made it clear what she thought of this proposal. We sat in her office, Seattle's, perpetual rain streaking the windows behind her desk. I'd arrived prepared, both emotionally and with the evidence I'd gathered from Nathan's backup drive. By his income, he means the money I helped him earn by hosting client dinners, attending networking events, and maintaining social connections that benefited his career while I built my practice, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Not to mention the inheritance I put toward the down payment. Sarah looked up, raising an eyebrow. Inheritance? My grandmother left me $50,000. We used it for the down payment on the Queen Anne house. Nathan insisted we not mention it to anyone, said it made him look like he couldn't provide on his own. Sarah made a note, her expression hardening. That changes things. Do you have documentation? I nodded, retrieving the file I'd prepared. Bank statements showing the transfer from my account to our joint account, then to the escrow company. Also, emails from Nathan discussing how to frame this with friends and family. A small, satisfied smile crossed Sarah's face as she reviewed the documents. This is exactly the kind of detail that makes a difference. Well done, Rebecca. She set the papers aside and leaned forward. Now, about the Thornfield project. I've done some research based on what you shared. She opened a folder and spread several documents across her desk. The property Nathan's been pursuing sits on wetlands that were previously protected. The zoning board has consistently denied permit applications for development. However, she tapped a newspaper clipping. 3 members of the board were recently replaced in what the environmental community is calling a corporate-friendly reorganization. I studied the clipping, recognizing a familiar name. James Chen, Vivian's uncle. Precisely. Mr. Chen is now the board chair, and the first agenda item at next month's meeting is a review of previously denied permit applications, including the Thornfield project, I finished, which, according to property records, is officially owned by Thornfield LLC, a company registered to both Nathan Walker and, interestingly, Vivian Mercer. I felt a jolt of surprise. They formed a company together? When? Sarah checked her notes. Registration was completed 4 months ago, well before you discovered their relationship. The timeline made everything clearer. The company formation, the strategic positioning with the zoning board, the affair, all orchestrated to advance Nathan's ambitions, with Vivian as both business partner and romantic replacement. So this was never just about them falling in love, I said quietly. This was calculated from the beginning. Sarah nodded, her expression sympathetic but practical. People's motives are rarely simple, especially when money and status are involved. The question now is how to use this information to ensure you receive a fair settlement. We spent the next hour outlining strategy. While Washington was a no-fault divorce state, evidence of Nathan and Vivian's business relationship prior to our separation strengthened my position significantly. The inheritance documentation further undermined his attempt to claim greater ownership of our shared property. I want you to consider something, Sarah said as our meeting neared its end. Nathan's offering to buy you out of the house because he assumes you'll want to leave, that the memories are too painful, that you can't imagine staying there without him. He's not wrong, I admitted. The thought of living there alone. Who said anything about being alone? Sarah interrupted. What if, instead of selling your half to Nathan, you bought his half? What if you kept the house, not as a shrine to your marriage, but as an investment property? The suggestion caught me completely off guard. Live in the house where I found them together. I don't think. Not live there, Sarah clarified. Own it, redesign it, rent it out, sell it later when the market's even better. Don't let Nathan's assumptions about your emotional fragility dictate financial decisions. I sat with the idea, turning it over in my mind. The Queen Anne house was in a prime location, had substantial equity, and with Seattle's real estate market, would likely continue appreciating. From a purely financial perspective, Sarah's suggestion made sense. The emotional hurdle, however, seemed insurmountable. I don't know if I can separate the pain from the pain, I said honestly. Sarah leaned back, studying me. That's fair. But consider this. Taking control of the house transforms it from a symbol of betrayal to a symbol of your independence. Every decision you make about that property, from paint colors to tenant selection, becomes an exercise in reclaiming your agency. I promised to think about it, knowing Sarah was right about the financial wisdom, but uncertain if I could overcome the emotional associations. As I gathered my things to leave, she handed me a business card. One more thing. This is Caroline West. She's a financial advisor who specializes in helping women establish independence after divorce. Given what we now know about Nathan's business dealings and the potential value of the Thornfield project, you'll want your own financial strategy going forward. Outside Sarah's office, I stood under the building's awning, watching rain pour. Onto the street, people hurrying past with umbrellas and raincoats. The city continued its normal rhythm while my life remained in suspended animation, not quite my old reality, not yet a new one. I checked my phone and found a text from Marcus. Showing the Lake Washington cottage at 3 if you're interested. No pressure. It was just past noon. I had time to meet with Caroline West first if she could fit me in. She could. Her office in Pioneer Square had none of the corporate sterility I expected from a financial advisor. The walls featured local. Art plants thrived on every surface, and Caroline herself, a woman in her 50s with a silver pixie cut and statement jewelry, exuded practical warmth. Sarah's filled me in on the basics, she said after introductions. Let me be clear from the start. My job isn't just to help you divide assets fairly, it's to position you for financial growth after this transition. Growth seems ambitious, I admitted. Right now, I'm mainly concerned with stability. Caroline smiled knowingly. That's what most of my clients say initially. But divorce, painful as it is, often creates unexpected financial opportunities, particularly for women who've been making decisions based on partnership rather than personal gain. For the next hour, we reviewed my financial situation, my private, practice income, retirement accounts, the home equity, and potential settlement terms. Caroline asked questions no one had thought to ask before about my long-term career goals, my risk tolerance, my vision for retirement. Based on what you've shared, she said finally, I have 3 recommendations. First, consider Sarah's suggestion about the house. Even if you decide not to live there, maintaining that asset makes financial sense. She held up a hand when I began to object. I understand the emotional complications, but emotions and finances rarely mix well. What are the other recommendations? I asked, reluctantly acknowledging her point. Second, we need to position you to benefit if the Thornfield project does move forward. If Nathan used marital resources, time, money, connections, to develop this business with Vivian while still married to you, you may claim a percentage of future profits. This possibility hadn't occurred to me. Is that really feasible? With the documentation you've gathered? Absolutely. I've seen similar cases where strategic investments during divorce proceedings yielded substantial returns. She made a note on her tablet. I'll work with Sarah on specifics. And the third recommendation? Caroline's expression softened slightly. This one's more personal. I want you to take some of your available cash, not a large amount, just 5 or 10,000, and use it for something completely unrelated to Nathan or your marriage. Education, travel, a hobby you've neglected. Something just for you. Blinked, surprised. That seems indulgent given everything else happening. It's not indulgence, it's reclamation, Caroline countered. Financial autonomy isn't just about assets and investments. It's about recognizing that your resources belong to you, to use in ways that reflect your values and priorities. She closed her tablet, fixing me with a direct gaze. What would you do with $10,000 if you didn't have to consider anyone else's opinion? The question lingered as I left her office, making my way to my car through rain that had finally lightened to a gentle mist. What would I do? For so long, financial decisions had been joint considerations, balancing Nathan's priorities, property, investments, appearances, with my more conservative preferences. The idea of making a significant expenditure based solely on my own desires felt foreign, almost illicit. By the time I reached the Lake Washington address Marcus had texted, I had no answer. My mind was too full of practical concerns, divorce proceedings, financial strategies, housing decisions, to engage with Caroline's more philosophical question about reclaiming resources for personal joy. Marcus was waiting on the porch of a small craftsman bungalow, its blue paint vibrant against the gray day. Unlike our Queen Anne home with its imposing presence and architectural significance, this cottage was modest, almost unassuming. Yet as I approached, I noticed thoughtful details. Stained glass insets in the front door, carefully maintained flower boxes, a small covered deck overlooking the lake. It's smaller than you're used to, Marcus said as he unlocked the door. But it has character. Inside, the space opened to reveal warm wood floors, built-in bookshelves flanking a river rock fireplace, and windows that captured a stunning lake view. The kitchen was updated, but maintained vintage touches. A farmhouse sink, glass-fronted cabinets, subway tile backsplash. A breakfast nook with a cushioned window seat looked directly onto the water. The owner is an elderly woman moving to Arizona to be near her grandchildren, Marcus explained as we toured the 2 bedrooms and updated bathroom. She's motivated to sell quickly, but wanted someone who would appreciate the home's history. It was built in 1924, and she's only the 3rd owner. I ran my hand along the smooth wooden banister leading to a small loft space, feeling the grain polished by decades of touch. Unlike the Queen Anne house, which had always felt like a showcase for Nathan's success, this cottage felt lived in. Personal, imbued with quiet history. "What do you think?" Marcus asked as we returned to the living room, where afternoon light had broken through clouds to cast patterns across the floor. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "But it feels like a dream world compared to everything else happening right now. How can I think about buying a new home when I haven't even finalized my divorce?" Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes concrete steps are easier than theoretical ones. Seeing real possibilities, like this house, can clarify what you actually want, not just what you think you should want. We stood by the windows, watching small waves ripple across the lake's surface. The peaceful setting contrasted sharply with the turmoil of recent weeks, offering a glimpse of what life might feel like once the legal battles and emotional wounds began healing. "I can't make an offer right now," I said finally. "There are too many variables. The divorce settlement, what happens with the Queen Anne house, my practice location." "No pressure," Marcus assured me. "But I'll keep it on your radar. Properties like this move quickly, even in this market." As we prepared to leave, I paused in the entryway, taking one last look at the cottage's interior. Something about the space resonated with me. Perhaps its modest scale after the grandeur of our Queen Anne home, or the way it embraced its history rather than showcasing status. "You know," Marcus observed quietly, "houses are like relationships. Some are built to impress others, some to comfort ourselves. The trick is knowing the difference." His words stayed with me as I drove back to the guest house, my mind toggling between practical concerns and deeper questions about what I truly wanted from the next chapter of my life. For 8 years, I'd lived in a home chosen primarily for its impression on others, Nathan's clients, our social circle, the architectural community. What would it mean to choose a space based solely on how it made me feel? By evening, I'd made 2 decisions. First, I would follow Sarah's advice about the Queen Anne house, attempt to buy Nathan's share rather than sell mine, viewing it as a financial investment rather than an emotional albatross. Second, I would take $10,000 from my personal savings and allocate it towards something completely disconnected from my married life. I just needed to figure out what that something was. The answer came unexpectedly while sorting through client notes I'd brought from my office. Among the files was a brochure for a 3-week intensive training program in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, a specialized approach I'd always wanted to incorporate into my practice but hadn't pursued, partly because of the time commitment, and partly because Nathan had dismissed it as unnecessarily academic when I'd mentioned it years ago. The program cost just under $9,000, required 3 weeks in Philadelphia, and started in precisely 1 month. I stared at the application deadline, next week, feeling a flutter of both anxiety and excitement. The timing was terrible given everything else happening, yet somehow perfect. Without allowing myself to overthink, I opened my laptop and began the application. This wasn't just about professional development. It was about reclaiming a path I'd set aside, about making a significant decision based solely on my own priorities and interests. It was, I realized, exactly what Caroline West had meant about financial reclamation. As I completed the application, I felt something shift inside me. A small but meaningful transfer of power from the woman who had made decisions in the context of marriage to the woman who was learning to trust her own judgment again. The program wasn't an indulgence. It was an investment in the person I was becoming, separate from the betrayal that had initiated this transformation. I submitted the application just before midnight, then sent an email to Caroline confirming. I'd followed her third recommendation. Her response came almost immediately. "Perfect. Now you're thinking like a woman with options, not obligations. Sleep well." And surprisingly, I did. dreamlessly and deeply for the first time since discovering Nathan and Vivian together. The path ahead remained complicated and painful, but I'd taken concrete steps toward a future that reflected my choices rather than my losses. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was movement in the right direction, the first real steps toward whatever came next. 2 weeks after applying for the trauma therapy program in Philadelphia, I received my acceptance email while sitting in a coffee shop near my practice. The momentary surge of excitement was quickly tempered by a follow-up thought. How would I manage this with everything else happening? 3 weeks away from Seattle meant 3 weeks away from divorce proceedings, from decisions about the Queen, Anne House, from my clients. I was still contemplating the logistics when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a Seattle area code. "Rebecca Parker?" a woman's voice asked when I answered. "This is Elaine Walker, Nathan's mother." My stomach dropped. In 8 years of marriage, Elaine had always been politely distant, approving of my professional status, but never quite warming to me personally. We'd settled into a rhythm of cordial holiday gatherings and occasional family dinners, where conversation remained safely on surface topics. Nathan had always claimed his mother was just reserved, but I'd felt her subtle evaluation, her unspoken conclusion that I wasn't quite what she'd hoped for her only son. "Elaine," I managed, voice steady despite my surprise. "How are you?" "I think we should meet," she said, bypassing pleasantries. "There are things we need to discuss. Are you free? For lunch today?" The directness was typical. Elaine never wasted words or time. Despite my instinct to decline, curiosity won out. "Yes, I could manage lunch. Where would you like to meet?" We arranged to meet at Louisa's, a small bistro in Madison Park that Elaine had always preferred for its discreet atmosphere and excellent salmon. As I ended the call, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the automatic tension that family interactions had always triggered, the feeling of being measured and found wanting. I arrived 15 minutes early, another habit from my married life, and requested a table by the window. Watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass, I considered what Elaine might want. To defend Nathan? To negotiate some aspect of the divorce outside legal channels? To express disappointment in my unwillingness to quietly accept Nathan's decision to leave? She arrived precisely on time, elegant as always in a tailored navy dress and pearl earrings, silver hair swept into a perfect French twist. At 68, Elaine Walker remained striking, the source of Nathan's height and cheekbones evident, in her patrician features. "Rebecca," she said, taking the seat across from me. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice." "Of course," I replied, slipping automatically into the polite demeanor I'd maintained through years of family gatherings. "It's good to see you." We ordered salmon salad for Elaine, as always, soup and half sandwich for me, and engaged in stilted small talk until the server departed. Then Elaine set down her water glass with deliberate precision. "I want to be direct," she began. "Nathan has made a terrible mistake. Whatever I'd expected, it wasn't this. I'm sorry. His relationship with Vivian, the way he handled everything with you. All of it. Monumentally poor judgment." Her tone remained measured, but I detected genuine disapproval beneath her usual reserve. "I didn't raise my son to behave this way." I sat in stunned silence, unprepared for Elaine to take my side, however obliquely. For 8 years, Nathan had been the sun around which her universe revolved, her brilliant, ambitious only child who could do no wrong. "He tells me you're being difficult about the house," she continued, misinterpreting my silence. "That you won't sell your share to him despite having moved out." Ah, there it was, the real purpose of this meeting. "I haven't decided what to do about the house yet," I said carefully. "My lawyer advises keeping it as an investment." Elaine nodded as if this confirmed something. "Nathan mentioned you'd hired Sarah Jenkins. She has quite a reputation." There was grudging respect in her tone. Nevertheless, I hope you'll consider what's fair. Nathan did put more money into that house over the years. Actually, I countered, feeling sudden clarity. My inheritance provided the down payment, and my income contributed equally to mortgage payments. The records are quite clear. Something flickered in Elaine's expression, surprise perhaps, or recalculation. I see. Nathan didn't mention that detail. There are many details Nathan hasn't mentioned, I suspect. I kept my tone neutral, but held her gaze steadily. The server arrived with our food, creating a brief reprieve from the conversation's tension. When we were alone again, Elaine surprised me by changing tactics. Rebecca, I want you to know that despite the current circumstances, I've always respected you. Your dedication to your practice, the way you've built something meaningful. She delicately speared a piece of salmon, which is why I'm concerned about how this situation might damage your reputation. My reputation? I repeated, genuinely confused. Contested divorces become public. Details emerge that reflect poorly on everyone involved. She fixed me with a pointed look. Nathan tells me you've been investigating his business dealings, gathering emails, making accusations about the Thornfield project. I felt a chill. Nathan knew I had accessed his backup drive, knew I was building a case around his business relationship with Vivian. How? I'd been so careful. I'm not making accusations, I said steadily. I'm establishing facts about when their relationship began and how it intersected with business interests that should be considered marital assets. Elaine set down her fork, her expression hardening. The Thornfield project has been Nathan's dream for years. He's worked tirelessly to make it happen. If the permits are finally being approved, that's due to his persistence, not some improper influence. If that were true, I said quietly, he wouldn't have needed Vivian's family connections, would he? For the first time in our 8-year relationship, I saw Elaine Walker genuinely rattled. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. You don't understand the complexities of development in this city, she said finally. Connections matter. Relationships matter. Nathan is simply being strategic. Strategic, I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. Is that what we're calling it? Elaine leaned forward, lowering her voice. Rebecca, be practical. Whatever evidence you think you have, pursuing this will only prolong the pain and create public spectacle. Nathan is prepared to be generous in the settlement if you'll be reasonable about certain matters, such as a clean break, no claims on future business ventures including Thornfield, no unnecessary delays in finalizing the divorce, and discretion about the circumstances of your separation. She delivered this list with the confidence of someone accustomed to setting terms. I studied her, seeing clearly for the first time the dynamic that had shaped Nathan, his certainty that rules applied differently to him, his expectation that problems could be managed through the right combination of charm and authority. He'd learned it from her. I've been offered acceptance to a specialized training program, I said, changing direction. 3 weeks in Philadelphia, starting next month. Elaine blinked, thrown by the apparent non sequitur. I don't see how that's relevant to our discussion. 8 years ago, when Nathan and I were first married, I mentioned wanting to pursue this training. He discouraged it, said it would take too much time away from supporting his career, building our social connections. I took a sip of water, remembering the conversation, how quickly I'd accepted his assessment. I set it aside, like so many other things, because his priorities always seemed more urgent, more important. That's marriage, Elaine said dismissively. Compromise is essential. Compromise, yes. Erasure, no. The words came with surprising force. For 8 years, I compromised again and again. My professional development, my friendships, my preferences, my opinions. I see now how many pieces of myself I set aside to fit the life Nathan wanted. And you resent that, Elaine concluded, her tone suggesting this was unreasonable. No, I corrected her. I take responsibility for it. I allowed it to happen. But I won't continue the pattern now that the marriage is over. I set my napkin beside my half-eaten lunch. I'm not being difficult about the house or the Thornfield project out of spite or resentment. I'm ensuring I receive a fair settlement based on my contributions to our marriage and shared assets. Elaine's expression had shifted from confidence to something more calculating. Nathan warned me you'd become hardened by this situation. Not hardened, I said quietly. Clarified. We finished lunch in strained silence, the pretense of family connection completely abandoned. As we waited for the check, Elaine made one final attempt. Rebecca, I hope you'll reconsider your approach. Contentious divorces leave scars that never fully heal. I thought of the scars already formed, the betrayal by my husband and best friend, the realization that our entire social circle had known or suspected before me, the evidence of Nathan's calculated use of relationships to advance his ambitions. The scars are already there, Elaine. I'm just making sure they heal on my terms, not his. Outside the restaurant, rain had given way to watery sunshine, a rare break in Seattle's gray February. Elaine paused before we parted ways. You're not what I expected, she said, studying me with new eyes. I always thought you were pliable, easy for Nathan to direct. So did I admitted. Thank you for lunch. As I walked to my car, I felt a strange lightness despite the tension of our encounter. Standing firm with Elaine, a woman who had intimidated me for years, represented another small reclamation of the self I'd submerged during my marriage. Back at Marcus's guest house, I found an email from Sarah Jenkins with the subject line, Urgent, Thornfield LLC. Opening it revealed documents Nathan's lawyer had finally produced under court order, the complete operating agreement for the company Nathan and Vivian had formed. Sarah had highlighted multiple sections showing that while Nathan contributed the initial property analysis and architectural plans, Vivian had contributed $200,000 in startup capital. The money had come from a trust established by her grandfather, the same trusted family member who now chaired the zoning board, considering the Thornfield permits. The picture was becoming clearer. Vivian had financial resources Nathan needed, family connections he could leverage, and a willingness to participate in his ambitions in ways I had increasingly questioned. I called Sarah immediately. What does this mean for the settlement? It means we have concrete evidence that Nathan was actively developing a business relationship with Vivian while still married to you, she replied, satisfaction evident in her voice. More importantly, it means any value created by the Thornfield project can reasonably be considered in part a marital asset, especially since Nathan used resources from your joint finances to develop the initial plans. Will that hold up in court? Washington law is clear. Assets acquired during marriage, including intellectual property and business interests, are presumed to be community property unless proven otherwise. Nathan can't prove otherwise because he used your joint resources, time, money, connections, to develop Thornfield while you were still married. I processed this information, thinking of Elaine's attempt to persuade me to drop any claims related to the project. Nathan's mother approached me today, suggesting I should accept a generous settlement in exchange for walking away from any claims on Thornfield. Sarah's laugh was short and sharp. Of course she did. They know they're vulnerable to this. The timing, forming the LLC with Vivian before your separation, creates a strong presumption of community property interest. The knowledge should have felt like vindication, but instead, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction at having concrete evidence of Nathan's calculations, sadness at how thoroughly he'd betrayed our partnership, and a growing resolve to ensure I wasn't further disadvantaged by his manipulations. What's our next step? I asked. We push forward, Sarah said firmly. I'm scheduling depositions for both Nathan and Vivian regarding the formation of Thornfield LLC. In the meantime, I need you to document every client dinner, networking event, or social function you hosted or attended that benefited Nathan's career. We're building a comprehensive case for your contributions to the assets he's now trying to claim as separate property. After ending the call, I sat in the garden outside the guest house, watching twilight settle over Seattle. My encounter with Elaine, followed by Sarah's revelations, had clarified something important. The resistance I faced, from Nathan, from Vivian, from Elaine, wasn't just about the divorce itself or even the financial settlement. It was about my refusal to accept the narrative they'd constructed, the role they'd assigned me in their story. I was supposed to quietly accept betrayal, gracefully exit the stage so Nathan and Vivian could proceed with their plans, and remain the accommodating, understanding woman who had spent 8 years prioritizing others' needs above her own. My determination to advocate for myself, to claim what was rightfully mine, to refuse the script they'd written, this was what they couldn't accept. As darkness fell, I opened my laptop and confirmed my acceptance of the Philadelphia program. Whatever complications it created for the divorce proceedings, this was a commitment to myself I wouldn't abandon. 3 weeks focused on professional growth, away from Seattle's constant reminders of betrayal, might provide exactly the perspective I needed for whatever came next, because something was becoming increasingly clear. This divorce wasn't just about ending a marriage or dividing assets. It was about determining who would write the final chapter of our story together and who would control the narrative going forward. Nathan had assumed that power would remain his, as it had throughout our relationship. My growing resistance to his terms, his timeline, his interpretation of events, represented a challenge not just to his financial interests, but to his fundamental understanding of who I was and what I was capable of becoming without him. Philadelphia in March was colder than Seattle, with a sharp East Coast bite that cut through my Pacific Northwest layers. I stood outside the red brick building housing the Trauma Therapy Training Center, my breath clouding in the early morning air, feeling both nervous and exhilarated. 3 weeks away from the divorce proceedings, from the Queen Anne house, from the constant reminders of betrayal, it felt like stepping into a parallel universe where I was defined by my professional identity rather than my marital status. The first day passed in a blur of introductions, preliminary readings, and orienting discussions. 24 therapists from across the country had gathered for this intensive training, each bringing unique perspectives and experiences. After months where every conversation had been shadowed by my personal crisis, the focus on clinical techniques and therapeutic approaches was refreshingly impersonal. By mid-afternoon, we'd been assigned to small working groups for the duration of the program. Mine included Leo, a veterans counselor from Detroit, Aisha, a family therapist from Atlanta, and Daniela, who worked with refugees in Miami. As we introduced ourselves more thoroughly, sharing our professional backgrounds and reasons for pursuing this specialization, I carefully edited my personal circumstances. I'm looking to expand my practice in Seattle, I explained. I work primarily with adults dealing with relational trauma, and I've found traditional approaches sometimes hit walls with certain clients. Same, Aisha nodded. Especially when the trauma patterns are deeply ingrained in family systems. You can't just cognitive behavioral your way through generations of dysfunction. Leo laughed. Try telling that to the VA system. Here's your 10 sessions, soldier. Fix 50 years of complex trauma in under 3 months, please. Their easy camaraderie was infectious, their professional passion evident. For the first time in months, I felt myself fully engaged in something beyond my personal pain. Remembering why I'd become a therapist, what had drawn me to this work before my identity had become so entangled with Nathan's. That evening, in my small hotel room, I checked my phone for the first time since morning, finding messages from Sarah about deposition scheduling and from Marcus about a maintenance issue at the guest house, nothing requiring immediate response. The distance from Seattle, both physical and psychological, felt deliberate and necessary, a space in which to reconnect with the parts of myself that existed independent of my marriage and its dissolution. ordered room service, and spread my training materials across the bed, diving into reading that would have been impossible to focus on amid the constant disruptions of divorce proceedings. The technical language, the research methodologies, the case studies, all demanded full intellectual engagement, leaving no room for rumination about Nathan and Vivian. By the end of the first week, our small group had developed a rhythm: intense morning sessions with the larger cohort, followed by afternoon practice sessions where we applied the techniques we were learning, alternating roles as therapist and client. The controlled vulnerability of these exercises, the careful application of professional skills rather than personal emotions, created a container that felt both challenging and safe. "You're a natural at this," Daniela observed after I'd led a particularly effective practice session using memory reconsolidation techniques. "The way you guided Leo through that narrative exposure, so precise, but still empathetic." "I agree," Aisha added. "You have this stillness when you're working, like you're completely present with whatever's happening in the room." Their observations caught me off guard. For so long, my professional identity had been secondary to my role as Nathan's wife, at least in my own perception. His subtle dismissals of my work as less concrete than his architectural projects, his impatience with professional conferences that took me away from supporting his networking needs, had gradually diminished my confidence in my career's significance. "Thanks," I managed, feeling a curious mixture of pride and disorientation. "I've been practicing for years, but sometimes I forget to notice what I'm doing well." "Classic therapist syndrome," Leo laughed. "We can see everyone's strengths, except our own." That night, I called Harriet Collins for the first time since arriving in Philadelphia. As my former advisor and mentor, she'd been supportive of my decision to attend the training, even as she'd cautioned me about the timing. "How's it going?" she asked when she answered. "Escaping your problems or actually learning something?" Her directness made me smile. "Both, I think. The training is incredible, challenging, comprehensive, exactly what I needed professionally. And being away from Seattle..." I paused, searching for the right words. "It's clarifying. I can think here without everything being filtered through the divorce." "Good," Harriet said. "Distance provides perspective. What's becoming clearer?" I considered the question carefully. "That I'm good at what I do. That my professional identity has substance and value independent of my marriage. That I've been letting Nathan's assessment of my career, subtle as it was, shape how I see myself." Harriet hummed, a sound that had always preceded her most insightful observations. "And what else?" "That I want more," I admitted. "Not just to maintain my practice as it is, but to expand it. Maybe develop a specialty in trauma therapy. Possibly even write or teach eventually." "There she is," Harriet said softly. "The woman I thought I was mentoring before she disappeared into Nathan Walker's orbit." The observation stung with its accuracy. "Was I that transparent? To someone who knew you before?" "Yes." Her tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. The Rebecca Parker I taught was intellectually ambitious, professionally driven, and personally independent. The woman who married Nathan became increasingly cautious, deferential, contained. I wondered where she'd gone. I sat with the uncomfortable truth of her assessment, remembering how my professional goals had gradually narrowed to fit the constraints of my marriage, how conferences had become guilty indulgences rather than career necessities, how writing ambitions had been shelved as someday dreams, how even my office location had been chosen primarily for its convenience to our home rather than its suitability for my practice. "She's finding her way back," I said finally. "Good," Harriet repeated, "because that woman was exceptional." The conversation stayed with me through the second week of training as we moved into more advanced techniques and applications. During case consultations, I found myself speaking up more frequently, offering insights and approaches that drew on my years of clinical experience in ways I'd hesitated to do before. too accustomed to qualifying my expertise, to framing my knowledge tentatively rather than confidently. It wasn't just the training content that was transformative, but the environment itself. Being surrounded by colleagues who valued my professional perspective, who saw me primarily as a skilled therapist, rather than as someone's wife, who engaged with my ideas directly rather than filtering them through relationship dynamics. Midway through the second week, I received an unexpected call from Caroline West, the financial advisor Sarah had connected me with. "I've been reviewing your financial situation," she said without preamble, "and I have a proposal I think you should consider." "I'm listening," I replied, curious about the urgency in her tone. "Sarah's deposition strategy is working. Nathan's lawyer reached out this morning suggesting mediation rather than continued litigation, usually a sign they're concerned about what might emerge in sworn testimony." I felt a surge of validation. That's encouraging. Very. But here's where it gets interesting. Nathan's specifically offering to buy out any potential interest you might have in the Thornfield project for a fixed sum. He wants it excluded from the general asset division. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, calculating what this might mean. He's worried about what the depositions might reveal about when the business relationship with Vivian began? Precisely. And he's offering $300,000 for you to waive any future claims on Thornfield profits or ownership. The figure was substantial, more than I'd expected, but Caroline's tone suggested caution. "What am I missing?" I asked. "Based on the preliminary permits that were just approved and the property valuation, if the Thornfield project proceeds, as planned, Nathan and Vivian stand to make at least $10 million in profit over the next 5 years. Potentially much more given the location and Seattle's development trajectory." I absorbed this information slowly. "So, $300,000 is a fraction of what your potential interest might be worth," Caroline finished. "It's not nothing. It's a meaningful amount of money. But it's also a clear indication that they're deeply concerned about your claim and willing to pay for a clean break. What do you recommend?" Caroline was quiet for a moment. "From a purely financial perspective, holding out for a percentage of future profits rather than a one-time payment would likely yield greater returns. But there are non-financial considerations: the ongoing connection to Nathan and Vivian, the potential for continued conflict as the project develops, the emotional toll of remaining linked to them in any way. These were precisely the complications I'd been gaining perspective on during my time in Philadelphia. The value of clean breaks versus ongoing entanglements, the balance between financial interests and emotional well-being. "I need to think about this," I said finally. "Of course, it's a significant decision. Just don't respond to any settlement offers until you're back and we can meet in person." Caroline paused. "How's the training going, by the way?" The abrupt shift surprised me. "It's transformative, actually, both professionally and personally." "Good. Remember that when weighing short-term financial gain against long-term well-being. Sometimes the greatest return on investment isn't measured in dollars." After we hung up, I stood by the hotel window, watching Philadelphia's unfamiliar skyline as twilight settled over the city. The Thornfield offer represented exactly the kind of decision I needed to make with clear eyes and firm boundaries. Not from a place of reaction or emotion, but from a centered understanding of my own best interests. The following day, our training focused on establishing healthy boundaries in therapeutic relationships, the balance between empathy and self-protection, between engagement and appropriate distance. As we practiced techniques for maintaining this equilibrium, I found myself applying the principles to my own situation, seeing parallels between therapeutic boundaries and the personal ones I needed to establish in the aftermath of betrayal. Boundaries aren't walls, our instructor emphasized. They're permeable membranes that allow connection while preventing harm. The goal isn't isolation, it's sustainable engagement. That evening, our small group decided to have dinner together at a local restaurant, the first social outing we'd managed given the intensive schedule. Over pasta and wine, the conversation inevitably turned from professional topics to personal lives. Leo spoke about his husband and their 2 adopted children. Aisha shared stories about navigating life as a single mother while building her practice. Daniela described her recent immigration from Venezuela and the challenges of establishing professional credentials in a new country. When attention turned to me, I hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm going through a divorce," I said simply. "My husband left me for my best friend after 8 years of marriage. This training is part of my process of reclaiming my professional identity separate from that relationship." The table was quiet for a moment, then Aisha reached over and squeezed my hand. "That explains the stillness I noticed in your therapeutic presence. You've been doing your own trauma work." I nodded, surprised by how easily the acknowledgement came. How much less painful the facts felt when stated plainly in this context. Among colleagues who saw me primarily as a professional peer, not as a victim of betrayal. "How are you managing the balance?" Daniela asked. "Between processing your own experience and being present for your clients?" "Carefully," I admitted. "I've reduced my client load, been transparent about taking personal leave when needed, and maintained my own therapy throughout." Leo raised his glass. "To professional ethics in the face of personal crisis. Not everyone manages that balance as conscientiously." Their matter-of-fact support, neither dismissing the significance of my experience nor defining me by it, felt like another piece of reclamation. Here, 3,000 miles from Seattle, I wasn't Nathan Walker's abandoned wife or the subject of whispered speculation among our former social circle. I was Rebecca Parker, skilled therapist, thoughtful practitioner, complex human navigating difficult circumstances with integrity. As the training entered its final week, focusing on clinical integration and application planning, I found myself developing a clear vision for how I wanted to implement these new skills in my Seattle practice. Ideas I'd only vaguely considered before now took concrete shape: specialized trauma groups, advanced individual protocols, potential consultation services for other therapists. During our final small group session, we each presented our implementation plans for peer feedback. When my turn came, I outlined a comprehensive approach for integrating trauma-focused techniques into my existing practice, including plans for eventually developing a training component for other clinicians. "This is impressive," Leo commented when I finished. "You've thought through the progression from individual implementation to broader professional contribution. This could position you as a regional resource for trauma-informed therapy." "I agree," Daniela added. "The phased approach makes sense, building expertise through your own practice before expanding to consultation and training. It's ambitious, but realistic." Their validation of my professional vision, seeing it as both significant and achievable, reinforced what had been gradually crystallizing throughout my time in Philadelphia. I had allowed my professional ambitions to contract during my marriage, and had internalized subtle messages about the secondary importance of my career compared to Nathan's. The divorce, painful as it was, had created space for these aspirations to expand again, to reassert themselves as central rather than peripheral to my identity. On the final evening of the training, as I packed my suitcase for the return to Seattle, I found myself both apprehensive and resolute. The 3 weeks away had provided exactly what I needed: distance from the immediate crisis, reconnection with my professional self, perspective on decisions still to be made. I was returning with new skills, clearer boundaries, and a stronger sense of what I wanted my life to look like beyond the dissolution of my marriage. I wasn't the same person who had fled Seattle in confusion and pain. I was someone new emerging, or perhaps someone originally returning, the woman who had existed, before gradually accommodating herself to a relationship that required her diminishment. Either way, I was no longer defined primarily by what I had lost, but increasingly by what I was reclaiming and discovering, professionally, personally, fundamentally. Rebecca Parker boarding the plane back to Seattle was equipped not just with advanced therapeutic techniques, but with a renewed understanding of her own value and capability. The divorce proceedings, the Thornfield offer, the Queen Anne house, these remained complicated challenges to navigate. But I was returning to face them with resources I hadn't possessed before: professional confidence, personal clarity, and the quiet strength that comes from remembering who you are beyond your most painful experience. Seattle greeted me with typical spring weather, a misty rain that hovered between drizzle and actual precipitation, the city skyline blurred at its edges as my plane descended. After 3 weeks of Philadelphia's distinctive urban landscape, the familiar contours of Mount Rainier and Elliott Bay stirred a complex emotion. Not quite homecoming, not quite estrangement, but something in between. Marcus was waiting at baggage claim, leaning against a pillar with casual elegance. His presence, unexpected but welcome, brought my first genuine smile since boarding the plane. "Thought you might appreciate a friendly face," he said, taking my suitcase. "Besides, the guest house has been quiet without you. Even the fountain seems to miss your morning coffee ritual." The simple kindness nearly undid me. After 3 weeks immersed in professional development, where emotional containment had been necessary and appropriate, the recognition of what awaited me in Seattle, decisions about the house, the Thornfield offer, the finalization of divorce, felt suddenly overwhelming. "Thank you," I managed, following him toward short-term parking. "How did you know when my flight arrived?" Sarah Jenkins called. "Said you'd have a lot to process once you landed and might appreciate some buffer time." He glanced at me with his characteristic directness. "She also mentioned there have been developments while you were away." In the car, Marcus brought me up to speed on practical matters: mail that had arrived at the guest house, maintenance he'd handled at my office, the status of the Lake Washington cottage I'd admired, still available, unexpectedly, as a previous offer had fallen through. His matter-of-fact updates provided exactly the grounding I needed after the disorientation of travel. "I've arranged for Sarah and Caroline to meet you tomorrow morning at Sarah's office," he said as we approached Madison Park. "They were quite insistent it happen before you have any contact with Nathan or his representatives." "That sounds ominous," Marcus shrugged. "Or strategic. From what little Sarah shared, it seems your time away coincided with some significant shifts in the negotiation dynamics. At the guest house, everything was exactly as I'd left it, yet somehow transformed by my absence. The space that had initially represented emergency shelter, a temporary refuge during crisis, now felt like a deliberate transition zone. Not quite my permanent home, but a place where I could safely determine what that home might eventually be. I spent the evening unpacking and reviewing notes from the training, deliberately postponing engagement with the stack of mail Marcus had collected and the numerous emails that required response. One night of buffer between Philadelphia and the realities of Seattle seemed essential for maintaining the clarity I'd worked so hard to achieve. The next morning, I dressed with deliberate care: a charcoal pencil skirt, burgundy silk blouse, and the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me. Professional, but not severe. Polished without appearing overly formal. The choices felt significant. A visual representation of how I wanted to approach whatever news awaited me. Composed, prepared, centered in my own strength rather than reactive to external pressure. Sarah's office seemed unchanged from my last visit, though the Seattle skyline beyond her windows had shifted from winter's stark outlines to spring's softer contours, cherry blossoms adding delicate color to the urban landscape. Caroline West was already seated at the conference table, documents spread before her, her distinctive silver pixie cut catching the morning light. "Welcome back," Sarah said, gesturing for me to join them. "Philadelphia agreed with you. You look more focused than when you left." "I feel more focused," I confirmed, settling into a chair. "The training was transformative. But clearly things have been happening here as well. Indeed. Caroline pushed a folder toward me. 3 significant developments. First, Nathan has increased his offer for your potential interest in the Thornfield project from $300,000 to $500,000. I raised an eyebrow. That's a substantial jump in just 3 weeks. It is, Sarah agreed. Which brings us to the second development. The zoning board officially approved the Thornfield permits last week. Construction can begin as soon as financing is finalized. So the project is definitely moving forward, I said, processing the implications. With Vivian's uncle's support, as expected. Yes, but with greater public scrutiny than they anticipated. Sarah slid a newspaper article across the table. This ran in the Seattle Times business section while you were away. The headline was understated but clear. Thornfield Development raises questions about zoning board connections. The article detailed the recent approval of permits for a project previously denied on environmental grounds, noting the relationship between board chair James Chen and Vivian Mercer, identified as both an investor in Thornfield LLC and the fiancé of lead developer Nathan Walker. Fiancé? I repeated, the word strange on my tongue. Which brings us to the third development, Caroline said, her expression unreadable. Nathan and Vivian have set a wedding date, June 15th, 3 months from now. The information should have the finality of it, the public statement of their commitment, the speed with which my replacement had been elevated to permanent status. But surprisingly, I felt little beyond mild discomfort at the awkwardness of the situation. 3 weeks of distance, of professional immersion, of reconnection with my independent identity, had created an emotional buffer I hadn't anticipated. I see, I said, closing the newspaper. And they're rushing the divorce proceedings to accommodate this timeline. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. Nathan's lawyer has been pushing for expedited mediation, settlement on all outstanding issues, and quick resolution before their planned wedding. I sat back, considering the interconnected pieces. The newspaper coverage creates pressure. They need the Thornfield project to proceed without complications from either the zoning board scrutiny or ongoing divorce proceedings. And they want to present a united front as a married couple when construction begins. You've summarized it perfectly, Caroline said, approval evident in her tone. Which brings us to the critical question. How do we leverage this pressure to your advantage? Sarah leaned forward. Nathan is motivated to settle quickly and cleanly. The increased offer for Thornfield indicates how much he wants your potential claims removed from the equation. But I believe we can negotiate for more, especially regarding the Queen Anne house. I've been thinking about that, I said, shifting to the question that had occupied much of my reflection time in Philadelphia. I don't want to live in the house. Too many memories, too much pain associated with every room. But I also don't want to sell my share to Nathan and Vivian, to have them living in the space we built together. Understandable, Sarah nodded. What alternatives have you considered? I want to buy Nathan's share instead, I stated firmly. Not to live there, but to sell it on my terms, to someone who has no connection to our history. A clean break for all of us. Caroline and Sarah exchanged glances. We anticipated you might come to that conclusion, Caroline said. I've run the numbers. With your income from the practice, the settlement funds, and a mortgage you could easily manage, it's financially feasible, but it would mean accepting a smaller cash payment from the Thornfield interest in exchange for Nathan relinquishing his claim on the house. That's acceptable, I said without hesitation. The house represents approximately 60% of our marital assets. If I take full ownership, with Nathan receiving a greater share of liquid assets and retaining his Thornfield interests, the division remains equitable while giving us both what we most value. Sarah studied me with evident approval. You've done your homework. This position is both reasonable and strategic. Nathan wants Thornfield free and clear. You want the house free and clear. There's a natural negotiation framework here. For the next 2 hours, we refined the proposal. Detailed terms for asset division, timelines for transfer of ownership, specific conditions regarding the Thornfield project. By noon, Sarah had drafted a comprehensive counteroffer to present to Nathan's lawyer, one that provided both sides with their highest priorities while ensuring I received fair value for my contributions to the marriage. One more thing, I said as we prepared to conclude the meeting. I'd like to request that Nathan and Vivian agree not to attend the closing when I eventually sell the Queen Anne house. I want that final transaction to be completely independent of them. Sarah made a note. I'll include it in the non-financial terms. It's a reasonable request for emotional closure. As we gathered our materials, Caroline placed a hand on my arm. I'm impressed, Rebecca. 3 weeks ago, you were still processing the shock and pain of betrayal. Today, you're making clear-eyed decisions about complex financial matters without being driven by emotion. The training helped, I acknowledged. Not just the professional content, but the environment, being valued for my expertise, reconnecting with my identity beyond marriage, remembering what I'm capable of when not defined by relationship to Nathan. Hold on to that clarity, Sarah advised. The coming weeks will bring pressure from Nathan's side to conclude matters quickly. Your emotional detachment is your greatest leverage. It allows you to make decisions based on your best interests rather than reactive emotion. Outside Sarah's office, spring sunshine had broken through the morning clouds, bathing the city in unexpected warmth. I decided to walk for a while, allowing my thoughts to settle before returning to Marcus's guest house. My path took me along the waterfront, past ferries departing for the islands, tourists exploring Pike Place Market, locals enjoying the rare sunny day. 3 months ago, I had walked these same streets in a fog of grief and disbelief, barely registering my surroundings, defined entirely by what I had lost. Today, I moved through the city with a clear vision, seeing possibilities rather than absences, future rather than past, choices rather than wounds. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Lake Washington cottage owner lowered price. Motivated. To sell to right buyer. Let me know if you want to see it again. I paused, looking out over Elliott Bay, considering the implications of his message. The cottage had remained in my thoughts during my time in Philadelphia. Its modest scale, its lakefront setting, its warm wooden interiors, so different from the Queen Anne house, which had always been more showcase than sanctuary. If I succeeded in buying out Nathan's share, if I sold the property on my terms, would the Lake Washington cottage represent the right next step? Not as a reaction to betrayal, not as flight from painful memories, but as an affirmative choice aligned with my emerging understanding of what I truly valued? I texted back, yes, I'd like to see it tomorrow if possible. Marcus's response came immediately. 11 a.m. viewing arranged. Owner will be there. She's interested in meeting potential buyers personally. The prospect of this meeting, of considering a new home that would be entirely mine, selected according to my preferences rather than negotiated compromises, felt significant in ways I hadn't anticipated. It represented not just housing, but agency, not just shelter, but identity, not just moving forward, but actively choosing direction. Back at the guest house, I found a package waiting. Materials from the Philadelphia Training Center with certification documentation and follow-up. Resources. Opening it, I discovered a note from our small group, signed by Leo, Aisha, and Daniela. Rebecca, your insights and compassion enriched our experience immeasurably. Whatever transition you're navigating, know that your professional gifts remain intact and powerful. Our little trauma team is cheering for you across the miles. Stay in touch as your practice evolves. Their words, recognition of both my personal challenge and professional capability, brought unexpected tears. For so long, I had compartmentalized these aspects of my identity, believing the personal had to be fully resolved before the professional could flourish. The training had shown me otherwise, that my own experience, while still painful, could inform rather than impede my work, that healing didn't require completion before contribution was possible. I spent the evening reviewing Sarah's settlement proposal once more, ensuring I fully understood every detail before it was presented to Nathan's lawyer. The terms were clear, fair, and strategic, protecting my interests while offering Nathan the quick resolution he needed for his wedding and business plans. The proposal included I would buy Nathan's share of the Queen Anne house at fair market value, using settlement funds and mortgage financing. Nathan would retain full interest in Thornfield LLC, paying me a one-time settlement of $400,000 for any potential claims. Our remaining assets would be divided equitably, with retirement accounts split according to their value at the time of separation. Nathan and Vivian would agree not to attend or interfere with the eventual sale of the Queen Anne house when I chose to sell it. All parties would refrain from disparaging comments in professional or social contexts. The divorce would be finalized by May 15th, allowing Nathan and Vivian to proceed with their June wedding as planned. Each element had been carefully calibrated, giving Nathan what he most wanted: freedom from claims on Thornfield, quick resolution, while securing what mattered most to me: control over the Queen Anne house, financial independence, clean break. The proposal wasn't about vengeance or maximizing financial gain. It was about establishing the healthiest possible foundation for my life post-divorce. The next morning, I met Marcus at the Lake Washington cottage, arriving early to walk the shoreline before the scheduled viewing. The water lapped gently against the property's small private dock, cattails swaying in the breeze, a family of ducks gliding past in perfect formation. The setting offered tranquility without isolation. Other homes visible along the lakeshore, but at a distance that provided privacy. "There you are," Marcus called from the cottage's back deck. "Come meet Eleanor. She's been looking forward to showing you the place properly." Eleanor Simmons proved to be a spry octogenarian with bright eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded me of Harriet Collins. As she guided me through the cottage, she shared stories of her 60 years living there, raising children in the cozy bedrooms, hosting grandchildren in the loft space, writing 3 novels at the desk in the sunroom, overlooking the lake. "This house has been a sanctuary," she said as we settled in the window seat of the breakfast nook. "Not just shelter, but a place that supported my work, my creativity, my sense of self through all of life's changes. Marriage, motherhood, widowhood, aging." Her words resonated deeply. The Queen Anne house, for all its architectural distinction and material quality, had never felt like a sanctuary to me. It had been a showcase, a statement, a reflection of Nathan's achievement rather than a container for genuine living. "It's beautiful," I said sincerely. "I can feel how much it's been loved." Eleanor studied me with perceptive eyes. Marcus mentioned, "You're going through a transition." "Divorce, I believe?" I nodded, surprised by her directness but not offended by it. "I went through that myself, long before moving here. My first husband, well, let's just say his priorities diverged significantly from mine." She smiled wryly. "Best thing that ever happened to me, though I certainly didn't think so at the time. Led me to George, 40 wonderful years together, in this house, and the writing career I'd always dreamed of but never pursued during that first marriage." As she continued sharing her story, the painful ending that had ultimately led to new beginning, I felt a curious sense of recognition, as if glimpsing a possible future through Eleanor's past. Not that our situations were identical, but the core experience of reclaiming identity after relationship dissolution, of discovering strength through necessary endings, formed a thread of connection across generations. "I'll be honest," Eleanor said finally. "I've had higher offers than the current asking price. But at my age, money isn't my primary concern. I care about who lives here next, Who carries forward the energy of this place? This house deserves someone who will appreciate its character, who will find healing in its spaces as I have. The statement hung between us. Not quite an offer, not quite a question, but an opening to possibility. I appreciate your candor, I replied. I'm still in the process of resolving my divorce, including decisions about our current home. But this cottage... I glanced around at the warm wooden beams, the river rock fireplace, the views of water from every window. It speaks to me in ways I didn't expect. It feels like a place where I could begin again, on my own terms. Eleanor nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. That's exactly what I hoped to hear. No rush on decisions. The cottage has stood here for nearly a century. It can wait a bit longer for the right person. But I wanted you to know my priorities extend beyond price. As Marcus and I walked back to our cars after the viewing, he observed, "She likes you. I've never seen Eleanor warm to a potential buyer so quickly." The feeling is mutual, I admitted. The cottage feels right in a way I can't fully articulate, like it's been waiting for me, as strange as that sounds. Not strange at all, Marcus replied. The right house is like the right relationship. When it fits, you know it on a level beyond logical analysis. The parallel to relationships wasn't lost on me. For 8 years, I had accommodated myself to a marriage that, in retrospect, had never quite fit, adjusting my expectations, modifying my needs, convincing myself that discomfort was simply the nature of commitment. The cottage, by contrast, seemed to offer alignment rather than adjustment. Spaces that complemented rather than challenged my natural inclinations. Back at the guest house, I received a call from Sarah Jenkins. Nathan's lawyer received our proposal, she reported. Initial response is cautiously positive. They're reviewing terms and will respond formally by tomorrow, but the framework seems acceptable. That's encouraging, I said, surprised by the relative ease of negotiations I had anticipated would be contentious. I think they recognize it's a fair division that gives both parties what they most value, Sarah observed. Plus, Nathan is clearly motivated by his timeline. The June wedding date creates leverage we wouldn't otherwise have. After we hung up, I sat in the garden, listening to the fountain's gentle music, reflecting on the convergence of events. The settlement negotiations progressing toward resolution. The Lake Washington cottage presenting itself as a potential new beginning, my professional path clarifying through the Philadelphia training. For the first time since discovering Nathan and Vivian together, I felt myself moving definitively from reaction to action, not just responding to betrayal, but actively creating the next chapter of my life. The decisions before me, finalizing the divorce settlement, potentially purchasing the cottage, implementing my professional development plan, represented not just recovery from loss, but affirmative choices about who I wanted to become. This wasn't the life I had planned or expected. But sitting in the twilight garden, surrounded by the quiet beauty Marcus had created, I realized it might ultimately be a life more authentic, more aligned with my true self, than the one that had been disrupted by betrayal. The bold decision point facing me wasn't just about property or settlement terms. It was about embracing the opportunity to redesign my life according to my own values, rather than accommodating someone else's vision. Whatever came next, whether Nathan accepted our settlement proposal, whether the Lake Washington cottage became my new home, whether my professional plans unfolded as envisioned, I was approaching these possibilities from a position of strength rather than vulnerability, choice rather than necessity, intention rather than reaction. The woman who had fled, in pain and shock from the Queen Anne house months ago, would have been paralyzed by these decisions. The woman sitting in the garden tonight, strengthened by distance, perspective, and reconnection with her core identity, was ready to make them with clarity and conviction. The settlement agreement was signed on a Tuesday morning, exactly 4 months after I'd discovered Nathan and Vivian together. We met in a sterile conference room at Sarah's law office. Nathan and his lawyer on one side of the table, Vivian conspicuously absent, Sarah and I on the other. The document between us represented months of negotiation, revelation, and ultimately pragmatic compromise. Nathan looked different, thinner, more tense than I remembered. The confidence that had once seemed his defining characteristic now appearing more like brittle determination. He barely met my eyes as we reviewed the final terms, initialing each page with mechanical precision. I would take ownership of the Queen Anne house, with plans to renovate and sell it. Nathan would retain full interest in the Thornfield project, paying me a lump sum to release any potential claims. Our remaining assets would be divided equitably, creating the financial foundation for our separate futures. The divorce would be finalized before their June wedding. "Is there anything either party wishes to address before we conclude?" Sarah asked when all signatures were complete. Nathan glanced up, finally meeting my gaze directly. Something flickered in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or simply discomfort, at the formal ending of 8 years together. "No," he said after a moment. "I believe everything has been covered." I nodded in agreement, surprised by my own emotional detachment. The anger and betrayal that had once consumed me had gradually transformed into something more measured. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of release. Nathan and Vivian's choices had catalyzed a painful but ultimately necessary reawakening of the self I'd submerged during our marriage. As we prepared to leave, Nathan hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Rebecca, I want you to know—" He paused, seemingly uncertain how to continue. "I never intended things to happen this way." The statement hung in the air between us. Not quite an apology, not quite an explanation, but perhaps the closest he could come to acknowledging the damage his choices had caused. "I know," I replied simply. "But they did happen this way. And now we both move forward." Outside the building, spring sunshine illuminated the city, cherry blossoms drifting across the sidewalk in delicate pink swirls. I stood for a moment, breathing deeply, recognizing the significance of what had just occurred. The legal entanglements of my marriage were resolved. The practical separation was complete. What remained was the emotional closure, still in process, but progressing steadily toward healing. 2 weeks later, I signed the purchase agreement for the Lake Washington cottage, sealing the connection with Eleanor that had grown through several more visits and conversations. She had indeed received higher offers, but had steadfastly maintained that I was the right next owner for her beloved home. "You'll find yourself here," she'd told me, her gaze direct and knowing. "Not the self you lost, but the one you're becoming. The water helps with that. Always changing, always the same." The renovation of the Queen Anne house proceeded simultaneously, transforming spaces that had been showcased into areas of warmth and functionality, replacing the austere design elements Nathan had preferred with softer, more inviting features. Each change represented both practical improvement for resale and symbolic reclamation of space that had once been dominated by his aesthetic. My professional life expanded as well. I began implementing the trauma therapy techniques from Philadelphia, developing a specialized component of my practice that quickly generated referrals and interest from colleagues. The seeds of larger ambitions, writing, teaching, consulting, took root in this fertile ground of renewed confidence and clear vision. Then came the invitation. It arrived on expensive cream stationery, addressed in calligraphy to Dr. Rebecca Parker, the professional title Nathan had often subtly diminished during our marriage. "Nathan Walker and Vivian Mercer request the pleasure of your company at their wedding." I stared at the card, disbelief giving way to understanding. This wasn't a genuine invitation. It was a statement, a public assertion that the divorce had been amicable, that no lingering resentment clouded their perfect narrative. My attendance would validate their version of events, would suggest that my replacement had been reasonable, expected, perhaps even welcomed. For days, I carried the invitation with me, uncertain how to respond. Ignoring it seemed petty. Accepting was unthinkable. Declining required an acknowledgement I was reluctant to provide. The situation represented the final thread connecting me to the life I'd shared with Nathan, the last opportunity for response rather than initiative. I discussed it with Harriet during one of our regular meetings, now focused on my professional development rather than personal crisis. "Why do you think they invited you?" she asked, her gaze shrewd beneath silver-framed glasses. "Image management," I replied without hesitation. "If I attend, it suggests approval, or at least acceptance. If I decline, they can say they extended an olive branch I rejected. Either way, their narrative remains intact." Harriet nodded. "And what do you want?" The question resonated beyond the immediate situation, touching on everything that had transpired since the discovery of betrayal. What did I want? Not in reaction to Nathan and Vivian's choices, but as an affirmative statement of my own values and direction. The answer came with unexpected clarity. I wanted completion. Not revenge, not validation, not even justice in some cosmic sense, just the clear demarcation between the life I'd shared with Nathan and the one I was creating for myself. The invitation represented an opportunity to establish that boundary on my terms rather than theirs. 2 days before the wedding, I drove to the address listed on the invitation, an exclusive waterfront venue north of the city. I'd called ahead, confirming that wedding preparations would be underway but that the couple would not be present during my scheduled visit. The event coordinator, assuming I was a guest with a scheduling conflict, readily agreed to show me around and accept a delivery for the bride and groom. The venue was spectacular. Gardens cascading toward the sound, a glass-walled pavilion capturing mountain and water views, intimate spaces for the ceremony itself. "The couple has requested a rather unprecedented seating arrangement," the coordinator explained as we toured the ceremony area. "Usually family members are in the front rows, but they've reserved spaces for colleagues from the architectural firm and members of the zoning board. Very unconventional." I nodded, unsurprised by this prioritization of business connections over family. It confirmed what I'd long suspected, that their relationship, like so much in Nathan's life, was structured primarily around advancement rather than emotion. As we concluded the tour, I handed the coordinator a sealed cream envelope, matching the invitation's quality. "Would you ensure this reaches Nathan before the ceremony? It's rather important." "Of course," she assured me. "Many guests send personal notes when they can't attend." Driving away from the venue, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't anticipated. The envelope contained no dramatic revelation, no bitter accusations, no attempt to disrupt their carefully orchestrated event. It held only the deed to the Queen Anne house, now fully in my name, and a simple note. "Nathan, this belongs to me now, as does my future. I release any claim to yours, and trust you will extend the same courtesy. May you both find what you're seeking. Rebecca." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. The wounds were still too fresh for that. But it was liberation. By acknowledging the reality rather than the pretense, by establishing clear boundaries around what was mine and what was not, I had completed the separation that began the moment I found them together. 2 days later, as Nathan and Vivian exchanged vows before their carefully selected audience, I stood on the dock of my new Lake Washington cottage, watching light play across the water's surface. The renovation was nearly complete, my belongings already transitioning from the guest house to this space that felt increasingly like home. Marcus had helped me install a small fountain near the water's edge, a tribute to the one that had provided such comfort during my time in his guest house. Its gentle music mingled with the lake's natural rhythm, creating a soundtrack for contemplation. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Received your note. Unexpected but appreciated." And I read it once, then deleted it without response. Whatever validation or closure Nathan sought wasn't mine to provide. Our stories had diverged permanently. Our narratives no longer required coordination or consensus. I turned back toward the cottage, my cottage. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet settling into certainty. The unexpected turn in my life journey had led me not to bitterness or diminishment, but to expansion, professionally, personally, fundamentally. My husband had left me for my best friend, and their wedding had indeed taken an unexpected turn. Not through dramatic intervention or public confrontation, but through my quiet reclamation of narrative power. The final chapter of our story together had been written in my voice rather than theirs, framed by my values rather than their convenience. Whatever came next, for them with their Thornfield project and strategic marriage, for me with my lakeside cottage and expanding practice, would unfold separately, parallels never again intersecting. The betrayal that had once seemed world-ending had ultimately proved world-creating, opening possibilities I couldn't have imagined in the safety of my previous life. Eleanor had been right about the lake's wisdom, always changing, always the same. Standing on the dock as twilight settled over the water, I recognized that I too had both changed and remained the same, transformed by pain but not defined by it, shaped by betrayal but not limited by it, forever altered but fundamentally intact. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.